It's 8 o'clock. Let's do attendance really quickly and get started. Bryant is here. Stay here. Curry. Harvey is here. She's online. Hamilton's online. Hellman is here. Ashley's here and State here. Both of the Millers are online. Norris is here. Yeah, State here. Yeah, and State here. Collins, not here. Saunders is online. Shamblin. State. Shamblin is not here. And Vargas is here. I miss anybody? Perfect. They don't want. All right. So for announcements, again, this week's lab is online because all you have to do is watch the video and answer questions. If you miss any questions, I got this question. It's a good question from one of your classmates. What can you do to fix your grade for this lab? Because it's not like the other labs where you just go in and fix a question. You have to actually rewatch the video and find the answer, right? So that could be a pain. And I said, I don't know. So if you guys have any ideas of what you could do for extra credit that's pertinent to this lab, the information in that portion of the lecture, let me know. I'm trying to come up with an extra credit idea. I don't know. I just have to come up with one. So anyway, let me know if you have one. If you have an idea. Yeah, that's it. So again, we're not meeting for lab today. All right, let's get started here. We're starting a new chapter. That was a good time to also point out that we are skipping chapter 12, right? So if you look on WVSU Online, it technically has stuff for chapter 12. Skip it, right? I didn't know if I was going to cover it or not. We were behind time, so we didn't cover it. So all the stuff that says chapter 12 is actually a repeat of everything that's in chapter 11, like the PowerPoints, the study guide, and all that. So you can ignore all that. All the pertinent information from your textbook that was in chapter 12, I squeezed that into chapter 11 because I only wanted you to know parts of chapter 12. Just the parts that were in the PowerPoint. Anyway, the first word for attendance will be ecology. So, usual stuff. If you're here, send it. If you're online watching this live, send it. If you're watching the video later, send me the word ecology, but also define it. Look it up somewhere, define it, and send that definition, including the source, because wherever you look it up, it's going to have a slightly different definition. It'll mean the same thing, but it'll just be worded a different way. All right, let's skip that a little bit behind. So this PowerPoint, just like the last ones, I'm basing this off of your old textbook. So I'm going to go through this one, and then at the end of it, I'm going to go and let you know, okay, by the way, we skipped this, we skipped this, we skipped this. That way, if you're reading it in your textbook, you can say, wait a minute, why didn't you cover this? And if I didn't cover it, it's because you don't need to know it. But anyway, like I said, since I'm using this from my old textbook, there are these things that I left on the PowerPoints because I do think they are worth reading for you. It'd be good for you to take a look at them. But I'm not going to test you on them, and there's because of that, I'm not going to spend any time talking about them, especially since we have a little bit of catching up. But this first portion was pretty interesting. It's about an invasive species. To me, invasive species is really fascinating. This particular story, because I lived in the Keys as a kid, so that one kind of hits close to home. Here we go. Let's talk about it. Here's what we're going to talk about. We're talking about a population overview, or an overview of population ecology. Then we're going to talk about population growth models. Then we're going to talk about applications of all this stuff that I'm teaching you. And then finally, we'll talk about human population growth. And a lot of this will be a refresher for you if you've had Bio 108. It's just kind of taught in a different context. So here we go, an overview of population ecology. First thing you need to know is what a population is. And I told you what this was in the last chapter, and I told you I'm going to tell you again. It's going to have a slightly definition, and here it is again. You need to know what a population is. So make sure if you're a note taker, write down. You don't necessarily need to copy this, but write a note and say, hey, I need to know what population is. It is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. So they're relying on the same resources, aka competing for the same resources. They're influenced by the same environmental factors, and they are likely to interact and breed with each other, right? So for the exam, I'm not going to ask you the definition of a population. I'm going to give you some example and say, There was all the squirrels on WVSU's campus. What is that an example of? Is it a population? Is it a community? Is it an ecosystem? That's a population, right? Because it's the same species, right? The squirrels on WVSU's campus. That is a single population. And I used this example last time I brought up a population. The squirrels on, I don't know, Kanawha State Forest. That's a different population. Yes, it's the same species. And they are kind of influenced by the same environmental factors, right? If we get hit by a blizzard, probably Kanawha State Forest is too. But if there's a fire at Kanawha State Forest, we're probably not going to be affected by that here. So anyway, yeah, they're different. That's a different population, even though it's the same species, because they're in a different location. Anyway, any questions about what the population is? All right, then let's talk about population ecology. I'm probably not going to ask you the definition of it, but this is basically what we're going to be learning in this chapter. So it's kind of like a preview, an explanation. I'm putting a question mark there because I might ask you the definition, but probably not. Population ecology is concerned with the changes in a population size, and basically the things that cause the population size to change. Now, your textbook talks about something called demographics, so if you're a note taker, you can write that down. I'm skipping that. There's a fine line, there's a very small difference between demographics and population ecology, and I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about demographics or demography, any variation of that word. So this next big bullet point, you don't necessarily need to write this down because we're going to talk about each one of these individually. But a population can be described in different ways. So the size of a population, right? So if we're talking about the human population, we would say, the human population is a little bit over 8 billion. The size of the population, right? That's usually what people think of when they think of population. Actually, like I said, we're talking about these individuals. So let me just move forward. Here's some pictures from your old textbook. These are some population ecologists. Here's somebody working on a bear. They're attaching a radio collar, so they can track it and see where it goes. Here we got somebody collecting data on a puffin. Here we have a researcher who's researching meerkats. All these are just examples. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you any questions about those. Actually, let me back up. Yeah, no, sorry. Population dynamics. Those are the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause variation in population size. This is important because, like I said, when we're talking about population ecology, the two things we're looking at the size of the population, right? How it's changing, and the things that are causing it to change. That's what this is. That's what population dynamics are. Basically, that's the best way to put it. It's the things that are causing it to change. Here's some new words for you. I don't think I've used them this semester yet. You know what they mean. Biotic and abiotic. It should be easy for you because biotic sounds a lot like biology, the scientific study of life. So we're talking about biotic factors. Those are just living factors. So if we were talking about the population dynamics for the squirrels on WVSU's campus, a biotic factor could be the feral cats that eat them, right? Feral cats are living, so that would be a biotic factor. If we talk about the abiotic factors that affect the population size of the squirrels on WVSU's campus, we talk about maybe, antifreeze that's leaking out of somebody's car, and they go drink it thinking it's water and they die. Or even water itself, right? The availability of water is also an abiotic factor, right? Water is non-living. So, or the weather, right? The climate here, an institute, that would be an abiotic factor. So if anybody have any questions about the difference between biotic and abiotic factors? All right. And I'll put another question mark next to this. Because again, probably not going to ask you the definition of population dynamics. This is more like it's telling you, hey, here's the stuff that I'm about to teach you. We're going to learn about this population dynamics. And an important aspect of population dynamics is population growth. I'll just leave that there for now because we're going to have a whole discussion about population growth. Let's talk about a little bit why population ecology is even relevant. It might not be specifically relevant to you in your everyday life, but in the big scheme of things it is. This is just a small list that came from your old textbook. That provides information for conservation and restoration projects. Like right here. Can anybody tell what that's a picture of? No? I know it's a little bit blurry. It's a picture of mountaintop removal, right? So that's how they get coal sometimes. They basically lob off the top of a mountain. Now, they can't just leave it like that. There are regulations. They have to basically try their best to fix the land. And that's where this comes in, right? So if they lob off the top of a mountain, and they just have this bare area like we do here, they can't just throw down a bunch of, I don't know, seed, right? Seed for grass, right? That has to be specific. They need the particular types of plants that were from here. They need plants that interact together, so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff that you have to know to be able to properly restore that area. And that's what, again, population ecology is for. It's used to develop fisheries, so this is pretty big in West Virginia. A lot of people like to fish and hunt, and that's where these rules come from, right? So when they have these laws that say, all right, you can go fishing, it has to be from here to here, and you can only catch this many, and you have to be this big. Same thing with hunting, right? You can do it at this time, you can only use this weapon, you can only kill this many of them, they have to be this age. All these rules, they're not arbitrary, right? There's scientists who come up with these rules. And we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout this chapter. These two bullet points are basically the same, right? Used to develop fisheries, used to manage wildlife populations. That's kind of a subcategory of that. And then finally, it provides insights into controlling how pests and pathogens spread. And I think that's what the thing with the elk was. I don't remember. No, sorry. I put a picture of the elk in there because this whole used to manage wildlife populations, this is a relatively new thing from West Virginia. They have reintroduced elk back to West Virginia. And again, you have to know where to put them and what they need, right? You can't just get a bunch of elk and put them in downtown Charleston. Like, hey, we brought elk back to West Virginia, right? You need scientists to know where to put them and other things to do. So any questions about this slide? All right. The next word for attendance will be elk. ELK. Normal rules. If you're here, you can send in for extra credit. If you're online watching live, you need to send in for your participation points. And if you're watching the video, send the word elk, but then also look up and tell me how many elk are in West Virginia. And include your source. All right, here we go. Like I said, when we're talking about population ecology, we're looking at populations, there's different ways to describe populations. We're talking about the size, which is the very easy one. We've already talked about that, right? Like the size of the human population is over 8 billion. But then there's population density, population age structure, all these things that we're about to talk about. So let's jump into it. Population density, very simple. It's the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. So for humans, you might say, oh, there's this many humans per square mile, right? That's a very common population density term. Some book examples, at least from your old textbook, you can say how many largemouth bass are there per cubic kilometer. Obviously, you're going to want to do cubic, right? For humans, you can say square per square mile because we live on land, right? Generally speaking, we're not in the air or underground. But if you're talking about something that's three-dimensional, like a lake, yeah, you want to say largemouth bass per cubic kilometer. Or how many oak trees per square kilometer in a forest. Or how many nematodes per cubic meter in a forest soil. All these things. Those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you anything specific about those examples. But yeah, that's what population density is. If you download this PowerPoint, click on that and watch a little video. The question is, how do we measure population density? For humans, it's, I don't want to say easy, but it's doable, right? So for humans, we have the census. Also, we keep track, right? There's actual records of when humans are born and when humans die. So for humans, we can do it. What about other things? Like, how do we know? If you were to look this up, someone probably knows how many squirrels are in West Virginia, right? No, there's probably a number out there on the internet, but no one has gone out and counted every single squirrel, right? Or if you were to look it up somewhere, somebody probably knows how many oak trees are in Kanawha State Forest. Again, no one's gone out there and counted every single one of them. So how do we do it? That's what this first bullet point is kind of what I'm getting at here, right? In most cases, it is impractical or even impossible to count all the individuals in a population. So again, get your brain off of the human population. That's what we do that for the human population. Talk about other things. It is impractical or impossible. So instead, ecologists use a variety of sampling techniques. I'm going to leave it. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit here. But your textbook goes into great detail about the variety of sampling techniques. So I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to go into details. I'm not going to ask you any questions about these examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the specifics that your book gets into here. But anyway, some sampling techniques include the number of bird nests, right? So usually if you're in ecologist, right? You might be looking at a particular species of bird, a particular population. And if you're studying, then you know, like, all right, for every one nest, there's this many birds that usually live in it, right? So they could theoretically go walk around through Kanawha State Forest and count the number of birds' nests in a particular area. And they count the number of birds' nests in another particular area. And keep doing that until finally they have enough data where they can say, all right, so there's probably, if there's this many birds' nests in this area, then there's probably this many birds' nests in the whole area. I don't know if that makes any sense. Without getting into too much detail, imagine this is the Kanawha State Forest. For some weird reason, it's big and square. So you go out and take some data, and like, I don't know, but it's 10 by 10, so maybe that's 100 square meters. And you randomly take some data here, and it's 10 square meters, right? Take some data here, 10 square meters. And it's all random. You just do it however many times. There's a formula that we use to figure out how many times you need to do it. But you don't have to do the whole Kanawha State Forest. You can just take samples every once in a while or at different spots, and then use some equations to extrapolate that data and say, all right, if this is what it is, this is the average of this one, this one, this one, this one, and however many other you got to take. And you say this must be the population density for the entire area. Anyway, that being said, again, they could use birds' nests. They could use rodent burrows, like, so for example, groundhogs, right? They're always popping in and out of the ground. It's kind of hard to count them, but scientists know, generally speaking, how many groundhogs live in a particular hole. So they can make those estimates. Termite mounds, again, the same thing. You're certainly not going around counting every termite, but we generally know how many termites live in a termite mound in any given size. Anyway, again, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask any questions about it. Do you have any questions about this slide? All right, so here's just a picture of what I was talking about, right? Here's a few groundhogs poking their heads out. They poke up, poke down, right? And again, you couldn't count them all. They all look very similar, constantly coming in and out, but you can make estimates based on the information you know, based on the information that we get from population ecology. All right, let's talk about population age structure. For you guys, this is probably more relevant than anything else. If any of you are business majors or plan on even being business owners, or perhaps you are criminal justice majors, this is stuff that'll be relevant to you because you could apply this towards the human population. So first thing you need to know is what an age structure is. The age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. So for example, I'm just throwing these numbers out there, I don't know if this is true. If we're talking about the human population in West Virginia, you might say, I don't know, how would I do this? 50 and up, let's see, 50 and up, I don't know, 20 and below, so what's that? 21 to 49. So let's say, I don't know, 80% of the population is older than 50%, or older than 50 years old in West Virginia. And I don't know, 10% is between 21 and 49. Obviously, these numbers are way out. I'm just throwing some easy numbers to calculate. Then we would know 10% must be 20 years and older, right? Because all that adds up to 100%. That's basically what the age distribution is, right? The age structure. We're just saying how many are of this certain age. So not only did I make the percentages up, but I also made these numbers up too, right? So if we're looking at the human population, we're probably not choosing those three categories, 50 and up, 20 and under, and everything in between, right? But those are just examples, but that's what an age structure is, right? So an age structure provides insight into the history of a population's survival. I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. For humans, that's a little bit less important. We're pretty much very aware of our population survival because, again, we keep constant data of who's born, who dies, how they die, things like that. Same thing here, reproductive success. So if you're studying the different species, again, the age structure can help you with that. For humans, that's a whole different thing because you're very aware of how many humans are being born at any given time, especially in developed countries. It also provides insights to how the population relates to environmental factors. So you should know that. I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily going to be a question about this, but let me give you an example of how this is important, right? So let's say there's some scientists that just went to some newfound deserted island and he's looking at this new population of birds, right? This bird species has never been studied before. So we're looking at it, and he can look and he can see these birds, and he knows the age structure, right? So he knows there's about a little bit fewer than, yeah, that's a percent. So like I was doing, right? So less than 10%, 1 year old. None of them are 2 years old. None of them are 3 years old. About 45% of the population is 4 years old. About, I don't know, less than 20% is 5 years old. Less than 5% is 6 years old, so on and so forth. So again, if this scientist just got to this place and just started studying the species of birds, populations of birds, and they had, I don't know, climate information from that place, this area, then even though they just now started studying this, they have some insight, right? They could say something obviously bad was happening 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and 10 years ago, right? Because there's no birds at that age. So then they can go look back and say, okay, what was going on in that area before we started studying these birds that was happening? And they might notice, oh, well, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and 10 years ago, there was a big drought. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there, right? So they could then say, this bird must be very dependent on rain for whatever reason. And then they could look and say, okay, well, 4 years ago, there was a lot of rain, right? So then that could help support their hypothesis in this hypothetical situation that said, you know, there was a drought 2, 3, 10 years ago, right? So again, that's how it would be important. Because, using this one example, a scientist could just start studying this population of birds and possibly get all this information about what's been going on, in this case, for 11 years, right? Just based on the age structure. Any questions about that side? All right, on a related note, we have something called life tables and survivorship curves. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult, and I'll slow it down when we get to the more difficult and more important part as far as the exam is concerned. First of all, let's talk about what life tables are. They track the survivorship, which is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages, and it helps to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. So let me just jump right into the example. I'll give you a human example. And again, I'm only going to talk about this briefly because this is biology. But this kind of information would be important for you when, I don't even want to say that. Okay, I won't get into that. But what this is saying, and you might get a graph like this or a table like this, and I might ask you questions about it. So you do need to be able to decipher a table like this. So this is saying humans that are ages, you know, what are the chances that a human that's born is going to make it to 10 years old, right? Long story short, it's a 99.2% chance. Actually, I won't do long story short. For that first line, I'll explain how it works. So they looked at 100,000 babies that were born, right? And out of those 100,000 babies that were born, 833 of them died before they hit the age of 10. And they did the math, and if you need to know, that's what the math is. 1 minus the deaths divided by the total number. Not that you need to know that, but if you feel like you do, then you know. And that's where we get this number. And that's basically, again, saying 99.2%. So there's a 99.2% chance that anybody born is going to hit the age of 10. And then they looked at this, right? So this is saying anybody who hit the age of 10, what are the chances of them getting to the age of 20? There's a 99.6% chance of that happening, right? So why is this relevant to population ecology? Again, let's say you are the person in charge, or the people in charge of, I don't know, the rules for fishing in West Virginia. Of course, you're not going to use human table, but you can look at something like this for the fish life cycle and say, okay, this is obviously a very vulnerable point of their life right here, and this is a very robust part of their life right here. So if this was for fish, you might look at this and say, all right, first of all, let's identify the low numbers. This one's low, relatively low, right? And it goes up, and it goes down a little bit, down a little bit, down a little bit, right? So you can see it starts off low, and then it starts really dropping off, I don't know, right here. Between here and here. Go from 97.3% to 94%, right? Everything else is kind of small increments going down. That's a big jump down right there. So again, if these were fish and not humans, you might say, okay, let's try to have them catch fish in this area where they're very robust and healthy. You know, they have a good chance of survival. Because you know, you guys have caught fish, you catch them, throw them back, so on and so forth. Anyway, I really don't know anything about fish management or ichthyology. I'm just using that as an example. The idea here is, again, you can look at a life table and realize, at what age are they most vulnerable? At what age are they most robust? And then base your decisions off of that. Any questions about this? All right. So this is the table, and as you should be very aware of from the labs, a lot of times when you have tables, you have graphs. And that brings us to this. Survivorship curves, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated for the exam. You will have questions about this on the exam. Someone always misses it. And I will admit, it can be a little bit tricky because the numbers are arbitrary, but let's talk about it. Survivorship curves plot the individuals that are still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. Basically, it's, again, what I just showed you on the table, it's just in a graph, right? It's in a line graph. Here's where it's a little bit different. Now, I'm going to ask you this portion, but it uses percentages, right? So instead of like having, for humans, instead of having, like I showed you that on the graph, what was like 0 to 10, and then 10 to 20, 20 to 30, whatever. You wouldn't have numbers in this situation because you want to use percentages, right? And the reason why is because then you can compare something like a human, which has a long lifespan, to something like a dandelion, which has a short lifespan. I'll show you what I mean. So here we go. You can see here, again, the percentages, right? So the percentages of the maximum lifespan. So let's say for humans, the maximum lifespan is about 80. So for humans, instead of having it where it's the actual numbers, where it would be, I don't know, let's just keep it like that. Let's say it's 100 years, right? Let's say 100 years old, 50 years old, 0. And then you have the squirrel. Let's say the average squirrel lives to be 20. I'm making that up. Then if you weren't using a percentage and you were using actual numbers, you'd have to put a 20 here, a 10 here. No, it's obviously 0 there. And it just wouldn't max up, or wouldn't match up, right? So that's why they use percentages, just so you know. Now, all that being said, I'm not going to ask you any questions about percentages. I just wanted to make sure you understood that. Here's what you do need to know for the exam. You need to know the difference between a type 1, type 2, type 3 survivorship curve. And the next slide I'm going to show you, it's going to have everything I'm about to say in writing, but I'll go ahead and show it, talk about it right now while the picture's up here. Type 1 survivorship, a good example is humans, right? Because we are humans. So the thing with the type 1 survivorship is most individuals live to be in old age, right? They don't die. A lot of humans don't usually die when they're young. You saw that with that table we just looked at, right? So the chances of living until you're old is pretty high. But then you hit that certain age, and I showed you on the table, right? Then your percentages of dying or living decrease, right? Your chances of living decrease dramatically. The older you get, that's what happens. Type 3 survivorship is the opposite. They use oysters as an example, but I think a better example would be like dandelions. Those little tiny seeds, right? Every time you blow one, you see those things flowing away. Each one of those is a seed. Most of them don't become a new plant. So most of those, and those seeds are basically babies, and they're all dying. Most of them are dying. How many of you guys have seen those nature documentaries with all the sea turtle babies, right? The mom, she comes in, she drops a whole load of eggs, she leaves, and they're all born. There's hundreds of them, thousands of them, and they all rush to the ocean. Most of them don't make it. Most of them die at a very young age because they crawl the wrong way, and they get drowned, and they get eaten, whatever the case may be. That would be type 3 survivorship. So the chances of surviving to become old are very low. But once you make it, your chances of survival, you're pretty much you're good to go. You're going to live in old age if you make it through the young parts. So this is a slightly inaccurate way of saying this, but for the sake of the exam, it'll help you. Type 1 survivorship is saying the chances of dying when you're young is very low. Type 3 survivorship is saying the chances of dying when you're young is very high. And again, that's not completely accurate, but for the exam, that'll help you. And then you have right here in the middle is type 2 survivorship, which is just, there is no particularly vulnerable part of the life cycle. You're just as likely to die when you're first born, or your middle age, or when you're really old. Any questions about this slide before I show you a slide that has everything I just said in writing? Okay. The next word for tennis will be squirrel. Normal thing if you're here, normal thing if you're watching this live. If you're watching the video, yes, send me the word squirrel. But then also look it up and tell me what species of squirrels live in West Virginia. Don't forget your source. Anyway, everything I just said is in writing. Type 1, and I didn't mention some of this, so this is good. Type 1 survivorship, they produce relatively few offspring, so that's something else you need to know. So again, think about a dandelion, each one of those little things that you blow, it floats away, each one of those is an offspring. We call it the seed, but botanically speaking, that's a baby. So think about how many humans, or how many babies a human has versus how many of those little fluffy things float away, right? So humans have relatively few offspring. Anything in a type 1 has relatively few offspring. Because of that, they also get relatively good care, generally speaking. Okay, so again, if you would compare humans to dandelions, humans to dandelions, then I guess that would be like them just walking around and just like giving birth really quickly and then just leaving the baby like, all right, well, I'm gonna go about my business, right? Like leave the baby, it'll fend for itself. Because that's what dandelions are basically doing. They put their seeds out there, like one of them is bound to make it because I put a bunch of them out there. Right? And again, the part that I was talking about when I was showing you the picture is this part right here. Increasingly likelihood to survive to maturity, which is a different way of saying the chances of dying young is low, right? So the chances of surviving being young is high. The chances of dying young is low. That's what that's saying. So any questions about type 1? Again, next is type 3, next in the discussion. Because type 3 is the opposite of type 1. Again, low survivorship for the offspring. Again, the chances of surviving being born, whether that be a seed or whether that be coming out of an egg, all that being born, very low chances of that happening. Followed by a period where the survivorship is high for the few who make it. And I guess what I didn't put on here, but should be on here since we addressed it here. Type 3 survivorship, again, it's the opposite of type 1. So type 3 produce many offspring. I don't know why I don't have it on there, so if you need to take notes, write that down. Type 3 survivorship, they produce many offspring, and they give poor care. Again, the idea here is they just put out a bunch of offspring instead of worrying about taking care of all of them, which would be practically impossible. They just think, if I put a bunch out there, surely some of them are bound to survive. Every single acorn on an oak tree is a little baby oak tree, right? They don't take care of them, they just put a bunch of them out there. Think, all right, surely some of these are going to survive. And then, of course, like I said, then you have type 2, which is just the middle of all those, right? It's intermediate. Intermediate survivorship, intermediate number of offspring, intermediate care for the offspring. That's the whole discussion on survivorship curves. Exam, you know the difference between type 1, type 3, and type 2. I'll probably give some example of like this species has this many offspring and takes care of them this way, and most of them die at this age, not that age, whatever. I'll give you some hypothetical example, and from that example I give you, you need to recognize it and say, oh yeah, that's an example of type 1. That's an example of type 2. That's an example of type 3. Well, this bullet point's wrong, because that should say see previous slide. Anyway, if there's no questions about this, we'll move forward again. Let's talk about life history traits as adaptations. Now remember, we just talked about adaptations, right? So we were talking about natural selection, right? That's what we were talking about with adaptations. These are things that help you survive your environment, or help a population survive their environment, thrive in their environment. First thing you know is what a life history is. Life history is the set of traits that set the schedule of reproduction and survival. So in short, we're talking about when are they reproducing, what age do they usually reproduce, and at what age they usually die. And of course, it gets a little bit more complicated with reproduction too. Not just at what age do they start reproducing, but what age do they stop, right? So for humans, there's a certain age where females and males are able to reproduce, and then there's a certain age where they're unable to reproduce, and there's time before and after that. And then there's also things like how many offspring do they have, right? And How long does it take? For example, for humans, it's 9 months. For elephants, they're pregnant for 22 months. Things like that, right? That's the schedule of reproduction. Not just when they can first start reproducing, but all the stuff involved. So the population's pattern of survivorship is important, a very important feature of its life history. It's not going to be a question. That's why we're talking about it. So key life history traits include, again, I've already kind of talked about this a little bit here, the age of first reproduction, the frequency of reproduction. So again, just using humans as an example, whatever age, whenever people hit puberty, that's their age of first reproduction. Scientifically speaking, that's when they're first able to reproduce. They can only have kids, once every 9 months, if that. Then that's just assuming they can get pregnant right away after giving birth. Usually, humans have one offspring at a time, rarely two, even more rare, more than that, the more rare it is. And again, the amount of prudence is very given. So any questions about this side? All right. Reproductive success is the key to evolutionary success. We've already talked about that, right? We're going to talk about evolution. This is a good reminder since it's going to be on the next exam. We're talking about evolution. That's all about reproduction, right? That's why I hate that term survival of the fittest. Because yes, you have to survive, but that doesn't matter because it's not just about survival. If you survive but you don't reproduce, it's useless. Likewise, if there's some way that something could reproduce really quickly, then it doesn't even matter if it survives long, does it? It's like if you've got something in you, some trait that allows you to reproduce right away, then what's, evolutionarily speaking, the survivorship doesn't even matter. Anyway, the combination of life history traits that represents the trade-offs or balance the demands of reproduction and survival. So basically what this is saying is, we talked about type 1 where the individual has very few offspring but takes good care of them, so therefore their offspring are likely to survive. And the opposite of that, which is very successful evolutionarily, right? The opposite of that is also very successful evolutionarily. Having many offspring, but not giving them much care, right? So you don't need to waste your time giving them much care. Some of them are bound to make it if you have a bunch of them. So, because selective pressures vary, the life histories are also very diverse. Basically, what this whole slide is saying is, thanks to natural selection, we have these different type 1, type 2, and type 3 because of natural selection, because there's advantages to each one of them. Depending on your situation or your population situation, you want to exploit those advantages. Which brings us to this. There's something called opportunistic life history. You need to know what it means. As far as I'm concerned, it's basically just talking about type 3 survivorship. Opportunistic life history is just type 3 survivorship. Except now, instead of talking about the survivorship curves, technically we're talking about it in the context of life history traits. So if we're talking about it in that context, we call it type 3 survivorship opportunistic life history. So they take immediate advantage of favorable conditions. So again, using this dandelion as an example, I'm sure you've seen it. You look outside your yard, there's no dandelions one day. The next day you look out, there's a bunch of them because the conditions were right, and they're like, oh, this is my chance. So now's the time to bloom. Now's the time to make these seeds and have the wind blow them away, right? Taking advantage of favorable conditions. They're quick. Again, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing for the exam is that they exhibit a type 3 survivorship rate. So, many offspring, not very well cared for. Chances of making it past being a baby, very low. Then there's the opposite. We need to know this. The opposite of the opportunistic life history is equilibrial life history. So as you might imagine, if this is the opposite of opportunistic life history, opportunistic life history is the type 3 survivorship. As you might imagine, since this is the opposite, this is basically a type 1 survivorship. But there are some other things that I'll tell you, and all these things are true, basically, usually of type 1 survivorship. They reach sexual maturity relatively slowly, right? So again, a dandelion's ready to go. As soon as that thing pops out of the ground, almost, it's ready to reproduce. Humans aren't, right? Elephants aren't. Coconuts aren't. We'll talk about that later. They generally produce few well cared for offspring. We've already said that. That's a key trait for the type 3 or type 1 survivorship. So again, using humans as an example, we usually only have one at a time, usually 9 months in between at the quickest. You take care of them, right? But it's not like dandelion seeds where we just let them fly off into the wind. And this is a good example. I don't think this is from your book. I took this because when you think about it, because I keep using dandelions as an example, in a sense, this is the opposite, right? I mean, there's a bunch of coconuts there, but there's much fewer coconuts than there are those little white, little fluffy things on a dandelion, right? And think about it, a coconut is a lot bigger than one of those individual little seeds from a dandelion, right? And what that means, when they're bigger, basically what that means is they're well cared for. I know that sounds weird because when you think of caring for an offspring, think of humans holding a baby and feeding it. But when you talk about plants, they don't do that, right? So in this case, what this is the big seed, the big floating seed that has a lot of its own water, its own protection, right? So they put a lot of resources into building each one of those individual seeds as opposed to having tiny little seeds. But of course, those are just examples. I won't ask you any questions about that. They're typically larger bodied and longer lived. So again, humans are a great example. I mean, elephants are a great example. They're relatively large. They are large. They live a longer time. Again, coconuts, using that as an example versus dandelions. Dandelions that big. Palm trees a lot bigger, right? Typically larger bodied, longer lived. And again, like I said, this bullet point here, which is the most important as far as the exam is concerned, if you just remember this, you're okay. Equilibrial life history, typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship. So if you're studying, what you really want is this next slide that I'm going to show you. But before I show you that, are there any questions about equilibrial life history? All right. So this is not from your book. So if you find yourself studying, you might want to pull up the PowerPoint. Because this is a nice little chart that compares and contrasts the two. This is what you're going to need for the exam, right? So opportunistic versus equilibrium, and this even gives more information that I went into. The climate, this is not necessarily true. These are all basic guidelines. It's not like 100% true, but like the climate's relatively unpredictable for opportunistic populations, relatively predictable for equilibrium, right? Time to mature, short for opportunistic, long for equilibrium. You can about this. Now, of course, I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these things. I'm not going to ask you a question where you have to list all of them. Again, I'll probably give you some example when I describe an opportunistic population, for example. I use a lot of these things in my description. And then based on all those things I said, you should recognize that as an opportunistic population. Or, again, I could use a bunch of these different things in my description, and you should recognize that as equilibrium. So any questions about that side? All right, and again, I'll remind you, that's not from your textbook. So if you're studying, you're going to want to pull up the PowerPoint. That's it for the first big bullet point. Maybe we can jump into the introduction to the second main bullet point, and then maybe be done for the day after that. The next word for attendance would be population. Keep with the same theme here. Again, if you're here or if you're watching live in person, just send the words anytime. If you're watching the video, send the word population, but then also look up what is the human population in the state of West Virginia. What is our population size? Sources. Anyway, let's talk about it really quickly, or at least jump into the introduction. And we've done a few minutes earlier. Obviously, as you know, population size fluctuates. What makes it fluctuate? Well, things coming in and things going out. It's that simple, right? Population grows when there's more individuals added, and it shrinks when individuals leave. How are individuals added? Well, they can either immigrate in, or they can be born, right? How are individuals removed from a population? Well, kind of the opposite, right? They either die or they move out. So any questions about how a population size fluctuates? Very simple stuff, right? So population ecologists have models that investigate how the size of a population may change over time under different conditions. So you need to get your head, when you're studying this, you need to get your head out of human population. So human population is pretty steady, right? For a long time, it's just been skyrocketing. That's not typical for most populations. So when you're reading this, again, try not to think of it in terms of the human population. Because when we get back, what we're going to talk about is basically the two different ways populations grow. An exponential growth or a logistic growth. Yeah. So that's it for today. And remember, we do not have lab today. I will see you on the Marine Corps birthday. That's this Friday, 8 a.m. in this room.